Hey everybody, I'm Ryan Ashley and I'm so excited to bring you one of my favorite techniques today, bead weaving on a loom. Here I have this gorgeous Lil Ricky beading loom. This also comes in a larger size, but I love this size, especially for getting started. I have the instructions because if you get this home and you use it to make this project, I want to be able to walk through the instructions with you, so when you read them to yourself, you're good to go. We have this kit that comes from JTB that includes little snippers, your fire line cord. This is the cord you use for creating and weaving your project, little beadsmith beading needles. And I also have 2 different colors of seed beads today. Now you can create elaborate patterns with this technique. We're just gonna do a simple kind of abstract speckled pattern because the goal here is really to focus on the technique. So first things first, we're going to want to cut a length of fire line cord. If you're one of the folks out there who's using Nymo cord, I love using that cord. You can actually leave it on the spool until you get through warping your loom, and you can slip it right through this little space here. So don't worry about cutting your Nymo if that's what you're using. I'm actually going to cut a pretty long length here of this fire line. I'm not going to use it all, but I want to make sure I have enough, and I also have a smaller amount to loop through the loom. So I'm snipping it, and then I'm actually wrapping it like this. I'm going to create my own little bobbin, so it's really easy to work with. Just take a second here. I get kind of hypnotized from this motion. Okay, so I'm actually going to go through the instructions with you, so that way you see them being put into action. And we are going to start with, we've already done the assembly, so we're going to start with step 5 here, warping the Little Ricky. And it says here, unless you're using a spool, you should keep the thread attached to the bobbin. If the spool or reel will not fit under the warp rods, cut off enough warping material, that's this, it's what we just did, to warp the loom. And the amount you cut off will depend on your project. So whatever project you use, if you're using instructions, it should tell you how much cord you're going to need. Here, we're just doing an exercise, not really a finished project. So it's fine to just get enough for the purposes of this. So this right here is the headstock, and this is the tailstock. This headstock is where we have these little pegs. That's how we're going to keep everything in place. So it says pass the thread over the headstock warp rod and over the tailstock warp rod to create the first warp. Now, how am I going to keep that in place though? I'm actually going to grab one of these pegs, and you see that little slit there? That is where I place the thread, leaving quite a long tail. I always like to leave a tail because you never know when you might need it. And then I'm going to place it in right there. I'm just going to do the second from the end, just for fun. Okay, I want to keep that in place. Now the instructions say to go over the headstock and over the tailstock to create the first warp. Now pass your bobbin or thread under the tailstock, so I'm going under, and under the headstock to create the second warp. There we go. Is it getting a little tangled? Story of my life. Let's see here. We're going to work with it. Okay. So this is the first warp. Over, over, and then under, under is the second warp. For the third warp, again, go over the headstock and the tailstock rod to create this warp. So we're going over and over. Repeat these steps until you have placed the required number of warps on your loom. So remember, you'll need 1 more warp, then the number of beads in the width of your project. So what that means is if you want a bracelet that's 6 beads wide, you need 7 warps. What's a warp? It's literally the thread passing over or under. So right now we have 3 warps. Now I'm gonna go, let's see if I can salvage this tangle. Okay, good, I'm gonna get just enough. So we're gonna go back under. Let me go ahead and cut this. Okay, so now I have, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4 warps. And I'm just gonna do, I'm gonna keep it where it is because I want to do 3 beads. Now, you don't have to really remember that information, but just look at it and tell me what you see. What I see is that I have 1, 2, 3 spaces to work with. That's where my beads fit. So let's go ahead and look at how to secure this. The last warp thread must go over a warp rod. Oops, mine is going under, so I need to pull it over. If I were to do another one, I would have done that perfectly. Okay, and then I'm going to wrap it around another peg to set the tension. So I'm taking that little slit there that we talked about earlier, placing it in, and then putting the peg in a slot down below. Oops, let me, okay. Now there's no way that you're gonna be able to just get the tension perfectly when you first put that peg in. So here's what you do. You actually turn the peg, and I do it to both of them. You turn it until you see those warp threads. You want it to feel a little bit like, if you've ever played guitar, your guitar strings. Yes, they can move. They're not so stiff and tight that they're gonna snap if you use them, but they're taut kind of like a drum. So I'm just continuing to tighten this a little bit until I get that nice, almost there. And this is the kind of thing too that once you make a few of them, you'll get a real feel in a sense for the perfect tension for you. So we're good to go there. Now I'm gonna go ahead and move this out of the way because the rest of this is, I think you'll think it's pretty easy. So I'm going to use these matte beads as my main color. I'm gonna pour a few out, and they'll probably fly everywhere, but you know, that's okay. And then going to do a few shiny beads, just because I want to speckle those in. All right. I'm going to cut another length of the fire line. Now you can always add more thread as you go, but if you start with too much, you could end up tangled like I did earlier. And it's really sad when you get a tangle in the middle of your beading project, because then you might have to undo some of your work, and I don't want you to have to do that. It can be a little heartbreaking. So I'm gonna go ahead and kind of squeeze on this end so I smooth it out and make it really nice and flat for threading through the eye of this needle. Okay, this is probably the hardest part of the project. So what I always tell folks to do is squeeze the thread until you almost can't see it anymore, between your thumb and your forefinger or whatever fingers you're working with, and put the eye of the needle right on top. And by doing that, as you open your fingers, it sort of forces the thread through the eye of the needle, which I'm not looking at it closely enough, so there we go. There we go. So it just kind of forces it through. Don't know what the science is behind that, but I call it pinch and thread. Just made that up, actually. So now, what am I gonna do with this thread? I am actually going to secure it with another peg. So I'm gonna grab this other peg here and secure it right in there, just like we did the other two. Leaving a tail, because I probably wanna use this at the end to weave in my thread when I'm done with the project. So I stick this in, just gonna do it right in the middle here. There we go. And now, I'm going to turn it a little bit just to keep it in place, because it sometimes wants to just get out of that little slit there. There we go. And I know I'm working with 3 beads. This is a 3 bead wide project. So I am putting 3 beads on my needle. And then this part is really the funnest part. You're probably thinking, this space is way too big for those beads. Trust me, it'll work. So I'm holding them there with my finger. And then I'm going back through. So we went under, and I'm holding them in place, and now I'm going over and through with the needle. And now nothing is gonna look pretty right now. I'm just getting them down there. Let's pull out that thread a little bit. So you see how there's kind of some loose threads going on down here? I'm actually gonna pull on that because I want that to be taut. And this first row isn't really, the biggest deal on the planet, but I like to get it kind of as pretty looking as I can so I don't get tangled along the way. So I'm gonna do the same thing again. I have 3 beads, and I'm going under, holding them in place, and then I'm going over and through. Okay. Oops. If that can happen. And now I'm tightening it. Okay, the next one I want to add a little bit of glitter, so I'm going to use one of my shiny beads in here. I'm going to do a matte and a shiny and a matte. And then put them right there. And now you could do this all day long and create a wrap bracelet, or you could create one that's just long enough to turn into a ring. And we're actually going to turn this into a ring because it's the same technique you would use for a bracelet. With a bracelet, you would just add a clasp, but I want to make sure to show you the technique and not have you watching this video for an hour and a half. So we're gonna go ahead and do enough to make the length of a ring. Again, I'm putting 3 beads on every single time, putting them under the warped threads, and then over. So the language we're using here, words like warp, that comes from the way the threads are over or under here. So with fabric and textile production, there's something called the warp and the weft, and it's the direction that the threads are going, and that's what that's referring to. And I don't know all of the technical language around that, but if you're curious about it, it's actually kind of an interesting topic to learn about the way fabric is made and see how language used in other areas of art, fine craft, design transfers into jewelry making. I think that's pretty cool. So we're just going to keep doing this. And I'm noticing that as I work, same with playing guitar, your strings get loose. I'm losing a little bit of that tension, so I'm just going to tighten those rods a little bit. That's totally normal and you don't need to worry about it. Just a little tighten. Okay, now that you have the amount of length that you need to finish your project, I'm gonna go ahead and take this off the loom and show you how to finish the project. So I'm going to undo these little ends from the loom, just take it right off. stick it back on because, you know, if I don't put it back together now, it will never happen. And then take this off, put it back together. Oops. Get in there. Okay, and then I'm taking the pegs out. Right now it's gonna look a little hairy, literally, but you'll see. Here we go. I do want to tighten this a little bit, so let's see if I can tighten that up here. There we go. Do you see that? I just pulled on this back there and it tightened that right up. That's awesome. So now what I'm going to do is connect the two sides and weave in the ends so we don't have any of these hairies and we don't have any spots where it could come unraveled. So we want to make sure it doesn't come unraveled. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is connect the ends. We'll move this out of the way. This is the same technique I teach with peyote stitch, just showing you how to make sure that your ends are woven in so you get a really good connection here. So first things first, I'm going to go all the way through the row on this other side. And then I'm going to push these out of the way, just pretend they're not even there. And I'm gonna go back through the row on the other side. This is connecting it. This is basically what we can't do on the loom because it's not a circle. So we'll go right through here. And you see how it connected those two ends? Awesome. So now, and it'll end up looking a little bit better than this. This is just the beginning of what we're doing. Now I'm gonna go back through just two of the beads on the other side. So I'm kind of doing full circle here, pulling it tight. And then I'm going to kind of weave in and throughout the piece. Now you don't have to use black thread. I wanted to use it today so you could really see the contrast against the beads and see what you're doing. So what I'm gonna do here is then end in the middle of a row. The reason for this is if you end on the edge, then when you end up tying a knot, it ends up being this little bulky nub on the side. We wanna kind of hide it right between the beads. So I'm just gonna leave that there. And now I'm gonna start working with the other threads. Now, okay, a question you're probably asking is, well, how long am I supposed to make the woven beadwork? How do I know it's going to fit my finger? Great question. Well, the way you know how it's going to fit your finger is you go ahead and measure your finger in advance. Now, if you don't have like a fabric measuring tape, you can do it with just a string. You can cut a string to the size of your finger, and then you lay it down against your beadwork, and that tells you how long to make it. And that's it. So now I'm going to keep repeating this technique. Although with the other threads, I can just weave them in a few beads and cut them, as long as I save one to meet this one and tie a knot to make sure everything stays connected. The other ones are just, we're hiding them and we're making sure they're in there, but we don't need to tie them to anything. So this part, it's funny because I used to work in knitting shops and teach knitting, and the thing that people would always say at the end of their project is, I don't want to weave in the ends. I don't want to do it. And it's really, with a knitting project, you can imagine there's a lot to weave in. And it can take a couple hours. But when you've spent like 20 or 100 hours on something, man, the last thing you want is to say, I'm not going to weave in the ends. And then you get out in the world and you get a snag. And that one little knot that your whole piece relies on gets tugged at and you lose all your work. So with beads, I'm not spending 100 hours on these projects. We just spent a few minutes on this ring, but it's a few minutes that I don't want to have to repeat. I don't want to have to redo my project. So I want to make sure that all the strings are snug in my beads so that I don't have to worry about that. And another note on that, if you're one of those folks who is selling your jewelry, it really helps people feel more confident investing in beadwork jewelry when they know that you've taken every measure to make sure that their project is secure and the beads are not going to fall off. That's something I ask all the time. People ask me all the time when I used to sell beadwork jewelry. They said, well, is it strong? Is it sturdy? How do I know it's not just going to come apart? And I would say, because I took these like 8 strings and wove them back in my project over and over again. Okay, so we're at the very end here. We've woven in all of our threads and probably looked like a lot of work, but it actually only took a few minutes, so don't be scared. So now we're down to these 2 threads. This one I already wove through, and now I have it ready to knot with my other one. And now I'm just going to weave this one through to meet that one. And when they meet, we can knot them, and then we can clip them, and then we can wear the ring. So I'm gonna go ahead and do what I've been doing and go all the way through a row of beads. Well, this one's I've gone through a few times, so actually what I'm going to do is just go through one of the beads. There we go. And then I'll go back here. It's kind of like a maze. You don't always know where you're going to end up. Okay, so now I'm at that same spot as that other thread, but I really need to do a little bit more weaving. So I'm actually going to take this opportunity to go back through a little bit more and then go through here and then go through here. Actually, is that going to get me there? Let's see. Yeah, this will work perfectly. Okay. So now they're like right side by side. Now they could be coming out of the same spot, like coming toward each other, or they can be side by side like that. So I'm gonna go ahead and tie a double knot. And the thing that's great about the fire line is it really has sort of a wiry feel to it. So it really holds its shape and knots very well. I love, love, love Nymo thread, but I don't find that the knots are quite as secure. So if you are using Nymo, I would suggest getting a little bit of hypo cement or a little like fine needle tip, like super strong glue, and just dab the knot, your final knot, just to make sure everything is secure. So I have now tied this twice and I'm tying it really tight, and I'm gonna clip it. By the way, another thing I use is an X-Acto knife. So if you're at home and you don't have special tiny tip thread snipping scissors, you can use an X-Acto knife and get up really close to it right at the edge of the knot and get a really clean cut. There we go. So now, it's a little big for that finger, but here we go. Now you have a bead woven ring. And of course, now that I'm trying to show it to you, it's not wanting to get over my knuckle. There you go. Cute, huh? Thanks again for joining me for such a fun beaded loom project. Let's go ahead and take a look at the tools and supplies one more time. So here I have the Little Ricky beading loom and the instructions that came with it. I have number 10 Beadsmith beading needles, very important. Fire line, you can also use Nymo thread if you have that on hand. I use 2 different colors of seed beads, but you can use 1 or as many as you like. And then some handy thread snippers, but you can also use an X-Acto knife or something of that nature if you're careful with it to get close to those knots. Now that you're an expert bead weaver, what do you plan on making? Go ahead and tell us in the comments below. And if you'd like to pick up some supplies and tools like the ones we used today, we have all the links in the description of the video. Now while you're here, go ahead and like, subscribe, and ring that bell to make sure you get notifications every time we publish a new video. We'd love to continue making along with you. I'm Ryan Ashley, and it is a great day on Jewel School.